They tied her in the cowboy's tree. The Apache woman thought he would use her, but instead he... Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Winter dusk settled over Hollow Ridge in a heavy, muted way, the kind of cold that pressed into a man's bones whether he admitted it or not. Reed Callahan moved along the fence line behind his barn with slow, controlled steps, the snow cracking under his boots while he checked the repairs he'd made earlier in the week. He carried a short length of wire in one hand, a hammer in the other, and his breath drifted in steady, white clouds. Reed had lived alone on this patch of land for 4 years. He didn't come here for peace, not exactly. He came because it was far, because the town was small, and because no one asked questions. He liked building things with his hands, liked fixing a fence that would stay upright in the next storm, and liked knowing each step of his land without surprises. He had been a trail scout in the frontier campaigns before that, good at reading ground, good at knowing where danger waited. He survived an ambush once when the men beside him didn't, and the memory followed him everywhere. He stayed on this land because work kept his mind steady. His only real mission now was simple: survive the winter, repair what needed repair, and avoid the past that still tried to find him. By the time he reached the top of the slope behind the barn, the sky had dimmed into a flat blue-gray. He tested a loose fence post with one hand, felt it shift under the frozen earth, and began tightening it with practiced movements. His thoughts stayed quiet, focused on the rhythm of the work. He wasn't a man who liked noise or sudden change. When he finished, he slung the coil of wire back over his shoulder and made his way downhill. The barn loomed ahead, its outer boards weathered from years of storms. Reed intended to get inside, warm up near the stove, and prepare a simple supper. Nothing else waited for him in life. Nothing unexpected ever happened out here. That expectation broke a second later. As he passed the old pine tree behind the barn, a tree with a thick, low branch he'd always meant to cut, he heard something. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a faint, uneven sound, maybe a breath, maybe a suppressed cry. Reed stopped instantly, his body tightening the way it always did when something didn't fit the landscape. He turned his head slightly, listening again. There it was. Soft. Human. Instinct pushed him forward, step by careful step. His hand hovered near his holster, but didn't draw. He wasn't afraid, but he was alert. Men who survive violence learn to move like that. Slow, watchful, ready to react without overreacting. When he rounded the pine, he saw her. A young Apache woman, tied to the low branch by a rough loop of rope knotted around her wrists. Bare feet sunk into snow, dress torn and hanging unevenly. Her head was bowed, so low he could barely see her face. Her long black hair was tangled, feathers and thin strips of leather clinging to the strands. Her chest rose and fell in small, shaky breaths. The deerskin dress she wore had split down the front seam, revealing a faint line of cleavage and a bruise across the top of her collarbone. Her arms trembled from cold and strain. The shape of her body was noticeable even through distress. Curved hips, narrow waist, strong legs that shook from exhaustion and fear. Reed's stomach dropped in a way he hadn't felt in years. Someone had done this recently. Someone who might still be close. But she didn't look toward him. She didn't speak. She only bowed her head deeper, as if bracing herself for another blow. Reed felt anger rise, controlled, quiet, but real. He knew cruelty when he saw it. He remembered seeing prisoners left behind, remembered seeing civilians punished for things they never did, and remembered how helpless he had felt then. He stepped closer. She flinched hard. "Easy," Reed said, voice low. He didn't soften on purpose. He didn't know how, but he didn't bark it either. It was the kind of tone a man used when he wanted no trouble. She didn't look up. Her breathing quickened. Reed's mind ran through possibilities. Was she bait? Was someone using her as a trap? Was she alone? He scanned the ground for tracks. He saw 3 sets of boot prints leading away from the tree, heading north. The prints were shallow. Whatever men tied her here weren't carrying weight anymore. They were long gone. Reed put his knife to the rope and cut it clean through. The woman's arms fell forward. Her knees buckled immediately. Reed caught her before she hit the ground, his arms closing around her waist. She was freezing, skin icy even through the torn dress. She weighed almost nothing. Her breath hitched as he lifted her, but she didn't fight him. She didn't have the strength. Reed didn't think about what to do next. He just acted. "Come on," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He carried her through the snow toward the cabin, each step steady and deliberate. He felt her trying to stay conscious, her fingers curling weakly around the fabric of his coat. That small gesture hit him harder than he expected. Someone had scared her into silence. Someone had left her for dead. Inside the cabin, warmth from the stove rushed around them. Reed set her on the bed near the wall. The furs were old but clean. She pulled the torn front of her dress together with shaking hands, tried to cover herself. Reed looked away for a moment to give her privacy. He wasn't sure why that mattered so much all of a sudden, but it did. He crouched beside the bed. "Can you hear me?" he asked quietly. Her voice came out thin, almost broken. "Yes." "Name?" She swallowed. "Sahona." Reed nodded once. He didn't give his own name yet. He wasn't sure she cared or that she was fully aware of where she was. He brought warm water from the stove, poured some into a tin cup, and handed it to her. Her hand shook too forcefully to hold it steady, so Reed reached forward, wrapping his larger hand around hers, guiding the cup to her lips. She drank in short, desperate sips. While she drank, Reed's thoughts ran in several directions. Who tied her here? Why his land? Would they return? How long had she been standing there in the cold? He checked the rope burns on her wrists. His fingers were rough from ranch work, but he was gentle, moving slowly, watching her face for signs that she was in too much pain. She watched him briefly, her dark eyes full of exhaustion and fear. When she realized he wasn't going to grab her or shout at her, her shoulders loosened very slightly. She whispered, "They took me, left me, thought you were one of them." Reed shook his head. "No." That was all he said, but it was enough. He brought her a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She held it tightly across her chest, trying to hide the torn seam of her dress. Reed didn't stare. He focused instead on the stove. Adding more would to keep the cabin warm. He kept his distance at first, giving her space. But he didn't leave the room. He wouldn't leave her alone. Sahona lay back slowly, her body sinking into the furs. Her breathing evened out as warmth seeped into her skin. She looked at him once more, studying the way he sat in the wooden chair near the door with his rifle beside him, angled so he could reach it easily if needed. She whispered, voice heavy with confusion, "You didn't hurt me." Reed didn't look away from the window when he answered. Not ever. He meant it. Outside, the wind hit the cabin walls in dull, steady gusts. Inside, the air warmed by the stove formed a small pocket of safety neither of them had expected to share. Reed leaned back in the chair, watching the doorway, listening to the storm build, and feeling, deep down, something shift inside him, something he hadn't allowed in years. For the first time in a long time, someone else needed him. And for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, he didn't mind. The storm deepened through the night, pushing against the cabin walls in slow, rhythmic bursts while Reed remained in the chair near the door, boots planted, rifle leaned beside him, listening to the sounds inside the room as much as he listened to the wind outside. Sahona slept lightly, if it could be called sleep. She drifted in and out of it, breathing unevenly, fingers still clenched around the edge of the blanket, as if she expected someone to tear it away from her. Every so often she tensed, a quick shiver running through her shoulders the moment the wind howled too sharply. But each time Reed spoke quietly, the sound calm and steady. "You're safe here." A short sentence. Simple, but enough for her to ease again. He didn't sleep at all. He kept watch the way he used to when scouting, back straight, eyes scanning the window and the door, every sense tuned for movement. Old habits stayed sharp. He thought about the men whose boot prints he'd seen in the snow, wondered if they were trackers, drifters, traders, or the kind who hunted people like she was an object instead of a person. He knew the territory well enough to know he hadn't seen them around Hollow Ridge before. That alone meant they were trouble. When dawn finally broke, the sky stayed dim with heavy clouds, but some light seeped through the frost-covered window. Sahona stirred, turning onto her side with a quiet wince. Reed stood slowly, giving her space but staying close enough that she wouldn't wake alone. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening on the cabin walls, the stove, the rough wooden beams overhead. She looked at him last. A flicker of fear shot through her face before she recognized him from the night before. The fear faded, replaced by something still wary but not panicked. He cleared his throat. "Morning." She pushed herself halfway upright, keeping the blanket wrapped tightly around her chest. Reed noticed her wrists again, red rope burns, swollen a little from strain. He also noticed something more subtle, something people missed if they didn't pay attention. She was scanning the room, checking the corners, the door, the distance between herself and him. She wasn't looking for escape. She was checking if danger had followed her inside. Reed shifted back a step, wanting her to have room. "You're hurt. Stay there. I'll get something warm." He moved to the stove, poured water from the kettle into a tin mug, and stirred coffee grounds. He didn't know if she drank coffee, but warm liquid mattered more than taste. When he brought it to her, she hesitated, eyes on the cup, then on his hand, then on his face. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was stronger than last night, though still thin from exhaustion. Reed nodded once and sat on the stool near the bed, careful not to crowd her. After she drank a few sips, she lowered the cup and rested it on her lap, eyes drifting to her wrists again. "You ask who tied me," she said quietly. "I did not answer right." Reed watched her steadily. "You tell me when you can. No rush." She shook her head. "I want you to know." She took a breath, steadying herself. "They were not my people. They traveled between towns, selling things, taking things. They wanted me to go with them to a place across the ridge. I said no." Reed waited. "They forced me," she continued, voice tightening, "but when one argued with the others about money, they tied me to your tree and left. They said snow would finish what they started." Reed felt his jaw tighten. The tree was on his land. They had chosen it. That meant they knew the property was remote, isolated, perfect for hiding cruelty. He didn't voice the thought. There was no reason to frighten her with what he suspected. Instead, he asked the question he knew listeners would want answered. "Why were you traveling alone?" She looked down. "I refused to return to a man from my mother's village. He was not my choice. I left. Some agreed with me. Others did not." She shifted her blanket, pulling it higher across her chest, her fingers pressing hard into the fabric. "I walked toward the ridge to find the trader's road. I thought I could trade beadwork for food. Then those men came." Reed listened without interrupting. Her explanation filled the gaps that hung unanswered the night before. Why she was alone, why she was near his land, why someone would want to hurt her. "What about your family?" he asked, voice level. "They think I went far south," she answered, shaking her head. "No one comes here. Not now. Not in winter." Reed breathed slowly. He understood what it meant to leave a place because staying felt impossible. He understood carrying guilt. Hers was different, but heavy the same way. "You can stay here until you're strong," he said. It wasn't a question. Sahona looked at him with surprise, her eyes widening a little as if she wasn't used to someone offering something without expecting a price. Her voice softened. "You want me to stay?" Reed's expression barely moved, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I don't leave people in the snow," he said, "and those men might come back. Safer you're in the cabin." He didn't say the other truth, that he didn't want to send her away into danger, that something deep inside him had woken the moment he cut her down, something protective and persistent. He didn't know her, but he knew suffering when he saw it. He'd lived alongside it long enough. Sahona pressed the warm mug between her hands, trying to absorb as much heat as possible. "I will help with work," she said quietly, almost urgently. "I did not want to be a burden." Reed shook his head once. "You rest. Work comes after strength." For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, with a hesitant motion, she reached toward her torn dress, fingers brushing the ripped seam. I cannot go out like this." Reed looked away to give her privacy again. "There's cloth in the trunk. You can use it to stitch the dress. Or make a new one. Whatever you need." She studied him carefully, as if trying to understand why he had not taken advantage of her vulnerability, why he kept turning his eyes away, why he spoke like someone who carried weight but never showed it. "You are not like the others," she said. Her tone wasn't soft. It was factual. Reed took a long breath and sat back. "I've seen enough wrong in my life," he replied. "I don't aim to add more." Sahona lowered her head, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of relief. The wind outside thinned slightly. Snow pressed against the window, but not as hard. Reed stood, moved toward the door, and checked the ground again. No fresh tracks. The men hadn't returned overnight. But that didn't mean they wouldn't. He planned quietly in his mind. Reinforce the door, check the ridge line, keep the rifle loaded, watch the tree line for movement. He would not leave her unprotected. When he stepped back inside, he found Sahona trying to stand, the blanket wrapped around her like a shawl. Her legs wobbled beneath her, her breath catching sharply. Reed crossed the distance quickly and steadied her by the waist, his hands firm but gentle. The touch surprised them both. Sahona froze for one heartbeat, then eased slightly when she felt no threat behind the grip. "I can stand," she said, embarrassed but determined. "Not yet," Reed answered. "You'll fall." She looked up at him then, really looked. The man who rarely spoke. The man who moved with rigid discipline. The man who carried quiet sadness in his eyes, but still helped a stranger without hesitation. She steadied herself on his arm, her fingers gripping him lightly. "I am better," she whispered, breath warm against his chest. Reed held her just long enough to make sure she truly had balance, then slowly let go, his hands lingering a brief second longer than necessary before he stepped back. In that moment, something unspoken formed between them. Not romance yet, not closeness, but the beginning of a connection neither had expected to feel in a lonely cabin on a winter morning. Sahona stood with the blanket wrapped around her, the warmth of the fire touching her bruised shoulder, and Reed watched her with the kind of attention reserved for something fragile but strong, something that had survived more than it should have. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. Inside, the first threads of trust settled into place. The storm eased into a slow, steady snowfall as morning settled fully over Hollow Ridge, laying a soft layer of white across the yard and the roof of the cabin. Reed checked the window again, watching for movement in the tree line, watching for any sign that the men who had tied Sahona to that pine might return. The prints he saw yesterday were already fading under fresh snow, which made it harder to track anything and easier for trouble to move without being spotted. Inside the cabin, the air had warmed enough that the cold no longer clung to every breath. Sahona stood near the stove with the blanket still wrapped around her, trying to hold herself upright without visibly shaking. She watched Reed carefully, not with fear, but with the kind of caution people used when they weren't sure yet if the quiet person in front of them truly meant safety. Reed opened the trunk beside the bed and pulled out two folded pieces of cloth, one thicker, one lighter. "Use whichever one works," he said, placing them on the table. "Needles and thread are in the tin box." She nodded, but hesitated before moving toward the table, as if unsure whether she had permission to walk across the room. Reed noticed the hesitation immediately. "You don't need to ask," he said quietly. "Move how you want." That seemed to loosen something inside her, and she crossed the cabin slowly, blanket held tight around her chest. She sat at the table, unwound the torn edges of her dress under the blanket, and examined the damage. Her fingers traced the ripped seam, the bruised skin beneath it, and Reed saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she clenched her jaw to keep herself composed. He turned away to give her privacy while she worked, busying himself with preparing breakfast, coffee, warm beans, and what little jerky he had left. Supplies were running low because he usually spent winters alone, but he figured he could head into town soon if he needed to. Listeners would wonder why he didn't go for help immediately, and the answer was simple. Hollow Ridge was 2 days away through deep snow, and the closest sheriff wasn't a man Reed trusted with a woman like Sahona, not after seeing how people were treated in border towns. Reed preferred to handle things himself, quietly. Sahona threaded the needle with steady hands. She began stitching the dress, small, precise movements that showed she'd done this kind of work her whole life. She glanced at Reed occasionally, as if checking to see if he would object to her fixing clothes instead of resting. He didn't. Reed believed survival came from doing what made a person feel steady, and if the act of mending gave her control back, he wouldn't interfere. After a while, he set plates on the table. You should eat something. She finished a stitch, tied the thread, then lowered the blanket enough to slip the dress back over her shoulder, holding it closed with her hand. Only once she felt covered did she sit across from him. Her movements were slow but determined. As she ate, she finally asked the question that had been hanging between them since the night he found her. "You live here alone?" "Yeah," Reed answered. "Been that way a long time." She studied him with quiet focus. "Because you want it that way? Or because something pushed you here?" Reed didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to being questioned, but the silence between them now carried trust, not threat, and he decided she deserved at least part of the truth. "I was a scout," he said finally. "Worked for the army. Did things I didn't want to do. Survived things I shouldn't have. After that, I needed distance. This land was empty. Empty worked for me." Sahona absorbed that without fear or judgment. "You lost people," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Reed nodded once, eyes on the table. "Yeah." She didn't press him for more. She simply accepted the answer, and that alone eased something inside him. Most people demanded details. Most people dug into wounds. She didn't. After they finished eating, Sahona stood again, holding onto the table for balance. "I want to wash," she said quietly. "There is snow melting by the stove. I can use that." Reed considered the request. Her bruises needed cleaning. The blood on her dress and skin was drying. "I'll heat more water," he said. "You can use the corner behind the curtain." He strung a blanket between two beams, something he hadn't done in years, creating a small space for privacy. While she washed behind the curtain, Reed kept his eyes fixed on the window, hearing the soft rustle of cloth and the faint wince in her breath when the warm water touched a bruise. She emerged a few minutes later, hair damp, dress stitched in front enough to hold together. She looked more like herself, still tired, still shaken, but not as fragile as the night before. "You feel any better?" Reed asked. "Yes," she answered. "The cold is leaving my bones." Her voice was steadier now, her posture less defensive. She took a few steps toward the door, testing her strength again. Reed watched her carefully. "You planning on going somewhere?" She stopped. "No," she said softly. "Just seeing the light." She opened the door a crack. Snow drifted in, along with a cold gust that carried pine scent. She stood there, staring at the tree she had been tied to, breathing slowly. Reed stepped closer, not to stop her, but to be near if she needed grounding. "I remember their voices," she said. "They laughed when they tied me." Her hand shook slightly. "I thought I would die there." Reed's jaw tightened. "You won't," he said quietly. "Not here." She closed the door gently. "I believe you." Those three words hit Reed harder than he expected. "Whatever you need." She studied him carefully, as if trying to understand why he had not taken advantage of her vulnerability, why he kept turning his eyes away, why he spoke like someone who carried weight but never showed it. "You are not like the others," she said. Her tone wasn't soft. It was factual. Reed took a long breath and sat back. "I've seen enough wrong in my life," he replied. "I don't aim to add more." Sahona lowered her head, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of relief. The wind outside thinned slightly. Snow pressed against the window, but not as hard. Reed stood, moved toward the door, and checked the ground again. No fresh tracks. The men hadn't returned overnight. But that didn't mean they wouldn't. "And I've done enough wrong in my life." She walked closer, her breath faint in the cold. "You saved me," she said quietly. "I want to repay that. You don't owe me anything." Her eyes lifted to his, steady and clear. "I stay," she said, "until danger passes, until I am not hunted." Reed hesitated only a second before nodding. "Then stay." There was no romance in the words yet, no overt closeness, but something had formed between them. Something steady, something careful, something built on shared danger and the simple relief of not being alone. As evening settled and Reed lit the lantern, he realized something else, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He didn't mind her voice in the cabin. He didn't mind the way she moved through the room. He didn't mind the idea of someone else being there when night fell. Outside, Shadows thickened across Hollow Ridge. Inside, trust continued to take slow, deliberate shape. Evening settled over Hollow Ridge with a thick, quiet stillness, the kind that made sound travel farther and made a man's instincts sharper. Reed lit the lantern on the table while the fire burned low in the stove, filling the cabin with a steady orange glow. Sahona sat near the furs, stitching the final seam of her dress with slow, careful motions. Her hands were steadier now, and her breathing no longer carried the uneven tremor from the night he found her. But Reed knew recovery wasn't only about bruises. There were questions listeners would expect him to address. Questions about where the men came from, why they chose his land, whether they could return, and why Reed didn't immediately ride to town. Tonight, those answers began to take shape. Reed moved to the window for what felt like the fifth time in an hour. The snowfall had stopped, but the wind carried a faint echo through the trees. He narrowed his eyes, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved except shadows. Still, something sat wrong in his mind. He'd been a scout too long not to feel when danger lingered nearby. "You hear something?" Sahona asked quietly. He glanced back, surprised she'd noticed. "Just checking the line," he said. "Storm hides tracks. Harder to spot trouble when everything looks the same." She considered that, then asked the question she'd been holding since morning. "These men, do they know this place well?" Reed shook his head. "No, nobody comes back here unless they're looking for what's not theirs. My land is off the main trail. Quiet, hard to reach in winter. So why did they bring me here?" Reed took a slow breath. He had thought about that all day. "They wanted a place where no one would find you," he said plainly. "This ridge is a dead end. Most folks don't cross it." It wasn't a gentle answer, but it was honest. And Sahona didn't flinch from the truth. She looked down at the dress in her hands, pulling a final stitch taut. Reed stepped away from the window and sat across from her. "You remember anything else about them? Their names? Their camp?" She shook her head. "No names. Only voices. They spoke of going north to the Trader's Road. They argued about selling me." Reed's jaw tightened. That told him what he needed to know. These men weren't wanderers. They were traffickers moving between outposts. Towns around these parts had seen men like that before, the kind who disappeared when law came close. Reed had crossed paths with groups like them during his scouting days. They didn't leave loose ends. If they realized Sahona was gone, they would return a check. "Reed," she said softly, noticing the shift in his posture. "You think they will come?" "I think men like that don't like losing what they think they own," he answered. "So yes, they might." Sahona held the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and Reed regretted the bluntness for a moment. He wasn't trying to frighten her, but he also wasn't someone who lied to calm nerves. "Then you should go to the sheriff," she said. "Tell him." Reed exhaled slowly. "Sahona, that sheriff isn't the kind who helps. He's the kind who takes people like you and hands them back for money." Her eyes widened slightly, not from shock, but from recognizing a truth she likely already suspected about this territory. "You trust nobody," she said. He gave a short nod. "Not anymore." She studied him, her expression softening. "You trust me?" Reed froze for half a heartbeat, the words landing heavier than she probably intended. "Yeah," he said finally. "Seems I do." The silence that followed was intense. It carried an understanding neither of them had asked for, but both accepted. Sahona finished stitching the dress and rose carefully, letting the blanket fall from one shoulder. She moved toward the hanging curtain Reed had set up earlier and disappeared behind it. He heard the rustle of fabric as she changed into the mended dress. When she stepped out again, Reed turned his head instinctively, then forced himself not to stare. The dress hung correctly now, covering the tear, but her figure still showed through the soft, worn leather. Her hips, her waist, the curve of her chest, all outlined in a way that made Reed swallow a little too hard. But he kept his eyes respectful. He didn't want her to feel watched, not after what she'd been through. "It is better now," she said, smoothing the front seam. "Thank you for the cloth." Reed nodded, clearing his throat. "You did the work." She approached the table and sat again, but closer this time, not across the room as she had before. Reed felt the shift immediately, a quiet settling inside the cabin. She trusted him enough to sit within arm's reach. That mattered. "Reed," she said, voice low, "why did you come back to your land at that exact moment? If you had been even an hour later—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Reed leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I check that fence every night. It's habit. Have for years. Part of keeping the cattle in, part of keeping trouble out. You do it alone. Always." Sahona studied him, and then asked the question listeners would want answered. "Do you have family here?" Reed's eyes dropped to the floorboards. "No." She waited, giving him room to add more. "He did. Had a younger brother. He left years ago. Before that, my parents died when I was young. Spent most of my life working for the army. When I left, I didn't have anyone left but myself." Sahona absorbed that quietly. "You saved me," she said again, softer this time. "But also, maybe you saved yourself a little." Reed didn't respond. His chest tightened in a way he didn't expect. The truth in her words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. A sudden thump outside cut the moment short. Reed stood instantly, moving to the window with controlled precision. Sahona straightened, her breath caught. "What is it?" He peered through the frost. "Probably the wind knocking something." Probably. But Reed didn't trust probably. He reached for his coat. "Stay inside," he said. "Whatever you hear, don't come out unless I call for you." Sahona grabbed his sleeve, her fingers trembling slightly. "You go alone?" He met her eyes. "It's safer that way." She didn't release his sleeve at first. It was the first time she had touched him without fear or accident. Her choice, driven by concern, not desperation. Finally, she let go. Reed stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched under his boots. The evening light was fading fast, and the sky had turned a dull gray blue. He walked around the barn, checking each corner, listening for movement. Nothing at first. Then, he spotted it. A set of tracks. Fresh. Not his. Not hers. Leading toward the ridge. Reed's jaw set, his mind sharpening. They were back in the area. He crouched, feeling the tracks with gloved fingers. 3 men. Same size prints as the ones from yesterday. They were close. Too close. Reed straightened and scanned the tree lean before heading quickly back to the cabin. When he entered, Sahona was standing near the table with both hands gripping the wooden edge, waiting. He shut the door firmly. "They're nearby," he said. "Tracks are fresh." Fear rippled across her face, but she didn't panic. She lifted her chin, steadying her breath. "What do we do?" Reed loaded the rifle with controlled, quiet motions. "We prepare," he said, "and we stay ready." Sahona stepped closer, her hand brushing the back of his arm, a gesture filled with trust and something else, something hesitant but growing. "I stay with you," she said, "no matter what comes." Reed met her eyes, and the firelight caught the reflection of determination in both their faces. "Then we face it together," he answered. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the warning of what was coming. Inside, Reed and Sahona stood side by side, no longer strangers, connected now by danger, survival, and a bond forming with every quiet moment they shared. The night settled heavily over Hollow Ridge, and the air inside the cabin felt different, tense, tighter, charged in a way Reed recognized from scouting camps before ambushes. Danger wasn't knocking yet, but it was near, moving quietly, testing ground. Reed sat at the table, cleaning the rifle with slow, controlled motions while Sahona watched him from across the room, her fingers knotted together on her lap. She wasn't trembling the way she had when he first found her. She was afraid, yes, but she was also steady. Reed noticed that shift with a sort of quiet respect. Some people froze under fear. Others grew sharper. Sahona was proving to be the second kind. "Those tracks," she said softly. "How close?" "Close enough that they were here after the snow stopped," Reed answered. "But far enough they didn't come to the cabin." He didn't add the thought troubling him most. Men who scouted before returning usually try to see who they were dealing with. That meant they knew someone had cut her down, and they wouldn't forget it. "Do you know these men?" she asked. Listeners would wonder this too, whether Reed had any history with these traffickers. He shook his head. "No, but I've seen their kind. Bordermen, passing through trading posts and mining towns. They take what they want, sell what they can, and vanish when law gets close. Sahona looked down, processing. They won't stop. No, Reed said. They won't. Silence stretched for a moment. Sahona shifted her blanket and looked around the cabin. Her eyes moved from the stove to the trunk to the door, as if measuring how safe this place really was. Eventually, her voice broke the quiet. This land, why did you choose it? Reed paused. It wasn't a question he answered often, but listeners would ask it eventually, and Sahona deserved the truth. He leaned back in the chair. After the army, I wanted a place where no one followed orders, no one yelled, no one died beside me. Hollow Ridge was empty land. No ranchers, no miners, just forest and snow. I could build something here without the past breathing down my neck. And now your past followed, she said quietly. Reed's eyes softened. Not my past. Yours. She lowered her gaze, guilt flickering across her features. You saved me, and now danger came to you because of me. Reed stood, crossing the room in slow, steady steps. He crouched near her chair, resting one hand on the edge of the table beside her. Sahona listened carefully. She lifted her eyes. You coming here wasn't danger. Those men bring danger wherever they go. All I did was interrupt them. I don't regret that. She looked at him with quiet disbelief, as if she wasn't used to anyone speaking for her safety without wanting something in return. Most men, she whispered, do not help without reason. Reed held her gaze. Then, I'm not most men. The cabin seemed to tighten around that sentence. A shared understanding formed, one that wasn't spoken but felt. A sudden gust shook the cabin walls. Sahona startled, her hand instinctively reaching out. Reed placed his hand lightly over hers before she could pull back. It's just the wind, he said. If it were them, you'd hear more than that. She nodded, her breath calming under his touch. Reed didn't rush to pull away. Instead, he let the moment settle, her hand warm under his palm. She watched him carefully, her eyes tracing his face, the set of his jaw, the quiet lines of worry on his brow. You watch over me, she said, even when I sleep. Why? Reed straightened slightly. Because you should have someone watching over you, he answered. And because I don't turn my back on someone under my roof. Sahona absorbed that, then asked the question he hadn't expected but should have seen coming. Do you want me here? Or is it only duty? Reed inhaled slowly. Duty had driven most of his life. Orders given, orders followed, people protected because it was required. But this felt different. It started as duty, he admitted, but it's not anymore. Her eyes widened slightly, something warm flickering in them before she looked away to steady herself. Reed stood, giving her space. Let's set the cabin right, he said. If they come back, I want the place ready. He pulled the wooden bar across the door, hammered an extra board into the window frame, and checked the rifle again, making sure the chamber spun cleanly. Sahona helped where she could, handing him nails, holding boards steady, never getting in the way, but never sitting helplessly either. At one point, Reed stepped outside briefly to check the barn. Sahona watched through the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass as he disappeared into the dark. Her heart hammered in her chest. She waited, breath caught, until he returned. When he stepped back inside, she released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. You were worried, he said, wiping snow from his coat. She didn't deny it. You are the only one here. If you fall, I fall. Reed set his hat aside. I'm not falling. Not tonight. Night deepened. They ate together. Warm beans, bread Reed found in an old tin, coffee thick and dark. Sahona's hand shook at times, but not from cold anymore. Fear and uncertainty had taken a different shape, one tied to what might happen next. Reed saw it, felt it, and decided something had to settle before the night ended. We should make a plan, he said. Sahona tightened her blanket. A plan, in case they come back. She nodded slowly. What do you want to do? Reed leaned forward, elbows on his knees. If I'm outside, you stay inside. If they get close, you hide behind the stove. There's enough space. They won't see you unless they look hard. And you? She asked, her voice thin. I'll handle them. Sahona shook her head, panic rising. 3 men. You alone. Reed's expression stayed calm. I've done worse with less. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and something deeper, something like anger at the idea of him standing alone again while she hid. I do not want you to fight because of me. Reed's voice dropped, rough and honest. I'll fight because it's right, not because of you, not only because of you. Sahona stared at him, seeing something she hadn't fully seen until now. The weight he carried, the lines in his face carved by years of violence, the fatigue in his shoulders that never fully faded. But she also saw something else, a protector, a man who chose to stand between danger and someone who had no reason to trust anyone. She stepped closer, her bare feet soft on the wooden floor. She placed a hand lightly on his arm. You saved my life, she said. I will not run from yours. Reed didn't move for a moment. Then he turned his arm slightly, letting her hand settle more firmly. Then we'll face what comes together, he said. But I need you alive. Promise me that. Her fingers curled gently against his sleeve. I promise, she whispered. The lantern flickered. The fire crackled. Outside, the deep silence of the ridge pressed in like a warning. But inside the cabin, Reed and Sahona stood closer than ever, bound now not only by fear or survival, but by choice. A quiet, growing loyalty, and something beginning to feel dangerously close to affection. Night settled hard over Hollow Ridge, the kind of dark that made every sound feel louder than it should. Reed checked the rifle a final time, made sure the door bar was tight, and then lowered the lantern flame so the cabin wouldn't glow like a beacon in the snow. Sahona sat near the stove, her mended dress wrapped in a blanket, watching every move he made with a mix of fear, trust, and determination. She broke the silence first. Will they come tonight? Reed didn't lie. They might. Men like that don't wait long when something slips from their grip. Sahona swallowed, eyes drifting toward the window. You said they argued about selling me. Where? Who buys? Reed hesitated. Listeners would want that answer. They run people through mining camps, rail crews, brothels, and border towns. Anywhere law is weak and coin moves fast. Her breath shook, but she didn't look away. If they take me again, it will be worse. Reed's expression hardened. They won't take you. Not while I'm breathing. He meant it. She knew he meant it. The cabin fell quiet again, except for the soft crackle of the fire. Reed paced once more, checking the windows, then stopped when he noticed Sahona's shoulders trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of everything she had carried alone before reaching his land. He walked to her slowly. You holding up? She nodded, then shook her head, then let out a breath she'd been holding for too long. I keep thinking why they left me alive long enough for you to find me. If they had not argued, Reed crouched beside her. They didn't choose to spare you. They were sloppy, greedy, angry at each other. Their mistake gave you a chance. You took it. You survived long enough to get cut down. That wasn't luck. That was you. Her eyes softened, glistening in the low firelight. Do you believe that? Yeah, I do. She touched his sleeve lightly, almost testing whether she could. Reed didn't pull away. A sudden crunch in the snow outside made them both freeze. Reed stood in one fluid motion, rifle raised, gaze fixed on the door. Sahona moved behind the stove just as they planned. But after a tense moment, Reed relaxed slightly. Only a branch falling, he said, though his pulse was quicker. Still, the noise forced a new question to the surface, one listeners would ask. Reed, if these men come, why not leave with me? We could go to another place, another ridge. He shook his head. You're not strong enough to travel through deep snow. And if we move, we leave tracks they can follow. Staying here gives us walls, heat, high ground. Running would get us caught out in the open. She understood, even if she didn't like it. So we wait. We wait, Reed confirmed. Hours passed. Reed didn't sit. He stood guard near the door, arms folded around the rifle, eyes steady. Sahona watched him silently. How he never slouched, how he flinched at certain sounds, how his breathing stiffened when the wind howled too close. She realized something then, something she hadn't asked but knew listeners would wonder. Reed, have you faced men like this before? He lowered the rifle slightly. Too many. Raiders, slavers, deserters. Lost good men trying to stop them. Your ambush, she whispered. He nodded once. I lived. They didn't. I carry that every day. Sahona stepped out from behind the stove and approached him slowly. You carry it alone. He didn't deny it. She placed her hand lightly on his arm again, firmer this time. You do not have to. Reed didn't move for a long moment. Then he set one hand over hers, rough, warm, careful. I don't know how to let anyone close, he admitted quietly. You already did, she whispered. The cabin held that truth for a heartbeat too long, until Reed heard something outside again, not wind this time. A distant crack of snow under weight. He lowered her hand gently. Stay behind the stove. Now, she obeyed without argument. Reed moved to the window, lifted the curtain just enough to look. The forest was dark, unmoving, yet he felt eyes out there. Searching, measuring. They weren't here yet, but they were close. He set the rifle down only long enough to take Sahona's hand once more. It'll be all right, he murmured. She squeezed his fingers, fear and trust mixed together. Together, they waited in the dim cabin, two people bound now by more than circumstance, by choice, by danger, and by a bond forming quietly in the shadows while something hunted them from the trees outside. The night tightened around the cabin until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Reed stayed at the window, watching the tree lean with a rigid stillness that came from years of danger, while Sahona crouched behind the stove as they had planned, her hands gripping the blanket so tightly the fabric bunched between her fingers. The faint crack of snow Reed heard moments ago lingered in the air like a question neither of them could ignore. She whispered from her hiding place. Are they here? Not yet, Reed murmured. But someone's moving out there. One man, maybe two. They're scouting. Listeners would wonder, how did Reed know? How could he tell the difference between wind and danger? Reed answered that unspoken question himself. When you've spent half your life tracking people in the dark, you learn every sound they make. A man's step is heavier. Even careful men leave rhythm in the snow. Sahona pulled the blanket closer around herself. You think they know I'm alive? Reed didn't turn from the window. They know someone cut you down. They'll come to see who. It was blunt, but honesty mattered now more than comfort. Minutes stretched. The only sound inside the cabin was their breathing and the slow tick of cooling metal on the stove. Reed kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, ready to move at the slightest change. He didn't dare blink too long. Then Sahona asked something unexpected, something listeners would eventually question. If danger was always possible here, why did you live so far from town? Reed lowered the curtain slightly. Town never felt like safety. Too many people talking, too many people judging, too many who pretend to help but only make trouble worse. Out here, I knew what to expect. Quiet, work, my own rules. She studied his silhouette in the lantern light. You ran from the world. Yeah, he said softly. I did, and finding me changed that. Reed finally looked at her. I didn't choose this, but I'm not running now. A faint warmth flickered across her expression, fear mixed with gratitude, something soft surfacing beneath the tension. Another crunch sounded outside, closer this time. Reed moved silently to the door, lifted the bar just enough to check the lock, and positioned himself so he could fire without exposing his body. Sahona pressed herself lower behind the stove, but her eyes never left Reed. What if they break in? She whispered. Reed's voice stayed steady. They want if I can stop them outside first. But if they do? Reed hesitated a moment, something in him tightening at the thought of danger reaching her. If they get inside, he said, I put myself between you and them. That's the plan. Her voice almost cracked. You would die for me. Reed's gaze didn't waver. I don't plan on dying, but I won't let them take you. Ever. The answer shook her more than the threat outside. She pressed a hand against her chest, steadying her breath. She wasn't used to protection. She wasn't used to someone placing her life above their own. The sound came again, this time unmistakably footsteps. Slow, testing the perimeter. Reed moved to the second window, lifted the curtain a hair, and saw a shadow shift between the trees. The shape of a man. Maybe two. He lowered the curtain. They're circling the barn, looking for signs. They're trying not to be seen. What do? Sahona whispered. We wait, he said. We don't rush out. They want to make us come to them. And if they set fire to the barn? That was a possibility Reed had already considered. They won't, he said. The men you described don't risk losing horses or supplies. They want you alive. Sahona's stomach twisted. Reed, he stepped closer to her hiding place, crouched beside the stove, and lowered his voice. You're safe. I won't let them near you. Her hand reached out again, small, trembling, finding his sleeve. Stay close, she whispered. If you go outside, I don't want to lose you. Reed exhaled shakily, the first sign all night that fear lived in him too. Not fear for himself, but for her. I'm not leaving, he said. Not yet. He settled beside her for a moment, rifle across his knees, both of them breathing in unison. It was the closest they'd been since she arrived. Close enough she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Close enough he could smell the faint herb she used when washing. Close enough their shoulders brushed when she leaned slightly toward him. A soft thump echoed outside, the unmistakable sound of someone tapping the barn wall. Sahona flinched. Reed's grip tightened on the rifle. He rose slowly. They're testing boundaries, seeing if we react. Sahona's voice was barely a breath. And will we? Not until I know what they're planning. He watched the window, jaw tight, pulse steady but heavy. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps retreated. First one, then another, heading toward the ridge line, fading into the night. Reed waited a full minute before lowering the rifle. They're gone. For now. Sahona stepped out from behind the stove, trembling from adrenaline. They will return. Yes, Reed said, but now we know they're close. We know what we're dealing with. She stood before him, breathing hard, blanket falling slightly off one shoulder. Reed, I don't want to hide anymore. Not alone. He reached out, gently setting a hand on her upper arm, grounding her. You're not alone. Her eyes softened, filling with something fragile and warm. You stayed. You protected me. You didn't have to. Reed swallowed, his voice low. Maybe I did. Outside, the ridge lay still. Inside, something stronger than fear took root between them. Something neither could deny anymore. Dawn came slowly, pushing a pale gray light across Hollow Ridge. Reed had slept only in short moments, his body leaning against the doorframe with the rifle across his lap, listening for movement outside. Sahona had dozed against the wall near the stove, wrapped in Reed's extra blanket, her breathing soft but unsteady. When Reed finally stood to stretch the stiffness out of his back, she woke instantly, eyes darting toward him before calming when she recognized his silhouette. They came close, she whispered. I heard them. Reed nodded. They were scouting. They weren't ready to confront us yet. Last night was a test. She swallowed hard. And what happens when they stop testing? Reed looked toward the window. Then we stand our ground. Listeners would wonder why Reed didn't head to town for help. Why he didn't try finding allies. Why he chose to face danger alone. Reed answered that truth before the thought could even form. The sheriff out there isn't a man I trust. If he saw you, he'd hand you back to whoever paid him. Going town puts you at risk. Staying here keeps you under my protection. Sahona exhaled slowly, relief and fear tangled together. You think they know I am here with you? Reed considered this. They know someone cut you down. They don't know who. They'll come back soon to find out. They'll try something bolder. Sahona stepped closer to him, her blanket slipping slightly from her shoulder. Reed reached out automatically, adjusting it to cover her, his fingers brushing lightly across her arm. She didn't flinch this time. I'm not afraid to fight beside you, she said quietly. He shook his head. You're not fighting. You're surviving. I survived alone, she countered. But now, I don't want you outside facing them while I hide. Reed's expression softened. It won't always be like this. But right now, you're still hurt. If something happens to me, I need you strong enough to get out. You hear me? She hesitated, then nodded. I hear you. Reed set the rifle on the table and opened the trunk near his bed. Inside were supplies listeners might have wondered about. Ropes, old traps, a hunting knife, a small pouch of bullets. Reed began laying out what he needed. Sahona watched carefully. You prepared for this long ago, she said. Reed didn't deny it. Living alone means planning for every kind of trouble. But I never meant to use all this again. What changed? He paused. You showed up tied to my tree. The truth in those words tightened something deep inside both of them. As Reed worked, Sahona walked to the window and parted the curtain a sliver. Snow glittered across the ridge, undisturbed except for faint lines, tracks the night wind hadn't erased fully. They were close enough to see the barn, she said. Close enough to see the cabin, too, Reed added. She turned back toward him. Why do men like that exist? Why do they want to hurt those who have nothing? Reed leaned his hands on the table, the weight of years in his shoulders. Because no one stops them. Because they think no one cares. Because they believe people like you can't fight back. Her voice tightened. They're wrong. Reed looked at her, and she held his gaze. Something stronger, something unspoken yet certain, pulsed between them. He moved closer. You're safe here, he said. Not because of these walls. Because I'm not letting them take you. Her breath caught. You watch me like I matter. Reed stepped even closer, voice low. You do. The air between them shifted. Sahona reached out slowly, unsure but drawn. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the warmth of him beneath the wool shirt. Reed didn't move. Not away, not closer. He simply let her touch settle, grounding him in a way nothing else had in years. You saved my life, she whispered. Reed shook his head slightly. You saved it first. You survived long enough for me to find you. Her fingers curled gently into his shirt. Reed's hand rose, brushing a strand of her dark hair away from her face. Their foreheads nearly touched. Her breath hitched. Reed's voice softened. Tell me you feel safe with me. I do, she whispered. More than anywhere. The first kiss came naturally, slow, hesitant, filled with tension but gentle. Reed moved carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She leaned in, her hands rising to his shoulders, her body warming against his. Their lips parted slowly, breaths mingling, the connection steady and sure but modest. Reed touched her cheek lightly with his thumb, careful of every movement. You're not alone anymore, he murmured. She rested her forehead against his chest for a long moment. And you are not either. The moment broke when Reed's expression shifted, focus narrowing. We need to be ready. When they come back, they won't be quiet. Sahona straightened herself, calmer now. What do we do next? Reed grabbed a coat and pointed toward the barn. I check the property. I'll make sure nothing's been tampered with. You stay inside. Door stays barred. She stepped forward, worry tightening her voice. Come back to me. Reed touched her hand again, a brief, grounding gesture. I will. He stepped out into the cold, scanning every inch of the ridge as he moved. Because deep down, he knew the truth. The men were coming. And the next time they appeared, there would be no more scouting. No more circling. No more silence. It would be the confrontation they both had been waiting for. Reed moved through the snow with careful, slow steps, eyes sweeping every corner of the ridge. The cold bit into his hands, even through the gloves, but he barely felt it. His mind was fixed on one thought, in this before it reached the cabin. In it so Sahona could finally breathe without fear. The barn stood quiet. No broken boards. No tracks leading inside. Reed circled it once, twice, his instincts sharp. Then he saw it. Fresh prints behind the shed, half hidden where the wind couldn't reach. 3 sets. The same size and stride as before. They were close. Closer than ever. Reed turned toward the trees, raising the rifle. All right, he muttered under his breath. Show yourselves. The forest didn't answer at first. Then a crunch. Another. Then figures emerged. 3 men pushing through the snow, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes fixed on Reed with the confidence of people who thought the land belonged to them. The leader stepped forward, lean, unshaven, eyes cold. You've got something that belongs to us. Reed didn't flinch. She doesn't belong to you. The second man spat in the snow. She's worth good money. Step aside. No. The men exchanged looks, unsure why one man stood so calmly against 3. Reed kept the rifle steady, breath controlled, stance firm. Sahona's face flashed in his mind. Not the frightened woman tied to the tree, but the one who had trusted him, touched him, kissed him. And something inside him hardened. They'll try something bolder. Sahona stepped closer to him, her blanket slipping slightly from her shoulder. Reed reached out automatically, adjusting it to cover her, his fingers brushing lightly across her arm. She didn't flinch this time. "I'm not afraid to fight beside you," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You're not fighting. You're surviving." "I survived alone," she countered. "But now, I don't want you outside facing them while I hide." Reed's expression softened. "It won't always be like this. But right now, you're still hurt. If something happens to me, I need you strong enough to get out. You hear me?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I hear you." Reed set the rifle on the table and opened the trunk near his bed. Reed saw the angle instantly, and rage surged through him in a way he hadn't felt since the ambush years ago. "Not her," Reed growled, sprinting across the yard. The man raised his gun, but Reed tackled him before he could fire. They hit the ground hard, rolling through the snow. Reed pinned him, ripping the rifle away, then shoved him face down against the frozen earth. "You're done," Reed snapped. The man spat curses, struggling, but Reed tightened his hold. "Get up," Reed ordered coldly. "All of you." The leader groaned, clutching his shoulder as he stood. The second man crawled to his knees, dazed. Reed aimed a rifle at them, eyes unwavering. "You leave Hollow Ridge now. You don't come back. If I see you within 30 miles of this place, I finish what I started." The men stared at him, realizing now they had mistaken a quiet cowboy for an easy target. "We'll go," the leader managed. "Leave your guns," Reed commanded. They hesitated. Reed stepped forward, rifle still raised. All of them. One by one, the men dropped their weapons into the snow. Reed waited until they limped down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Only when he was certain they were gone did he finally lower the rifle. His chest rose and fell slowly, the adrenaline cutting through him like a knife, but beneath it came something else, relief. He turned toward the cabin. "Because I'm not letting them take you." Her breath caught. "You watch me like I matter." Reed stepped even closer, voice low. "You do." The air between them shifted. Sahona reached out slowly, unsure but drawn. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the warmth of him beneath the wool shirt. Reed didn't move, not away, not closer. He simply let her touch settle, grounding him in a way nothing else had in years. "You saved my life," she whispered. Reed shook his head slightly. "You saved it first. You survived long enough for me to find you." Her fingers curled gently into his shirt. Reed's hand rose, brushing a strand of her dark hair away from her face. Their foreheads nearly touched. Her breath hitched. Reed's voice softened. "Tell me you feel safe with me." "I do," she whispered. "More than anywhere." The first kiss came naturally, slow, hesitant, filled with tension but gentle. Reed moved carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She leaned in, her hands rising to his shoulders, her body warming against his. Their lips parted slowly, breaths mingling, the connection steady and sure but modest. Reed touched her cheek lightly with his thumb, careful of every movement. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured. She rested her forehead against his chest for a long moment. "And you are not either." The moment broke when Reed's expression shifted, focus narrowing. "We need to be ready." Reed pulled her against him, arms wrapping around her gently, and she pressed her face to his collar, her voice shaking. "I thought I would die tied to that tree. I thought no one would ever look for me. I found you," Reed murmured, "and I'm not letting you go." She lifted her head, eyes meeting his. "I don't want to go." Reed brushed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "Then stay. Stay with me." She smiled softly, a real smile, the first he'd seen on her. "I will." They held each other in the yard as the sun began to rise behind the ridge, casting a soft orange glow across the snow. The danger was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was warmth, closeness, and the quiet beginning of a life neither of them had expected. Reed kissed her, slow, sure, steady, and Sahona leaned into him with no hesitation. The cabin behind them wasn't just shelter anymore. It was home, their home. And in the cold light of morning, Hollow Ridge felt like the first safe place either of them had known in years.